The restaurant was one of those places in Hollywood where silence meant survival. Private, exclusive, the kind of room where powerful men spoke quietly and everyone else disappeared into the wallpaper. It was sometime in the early 1960s. Frank Sinatra sat at a corner table with members of the Rat Pack, Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, others. The room hummed with the careful energy of people trying not to be noticed. A young waiter, maybe 23-24 years old, approached the table. He was nervous. His hands shook slightly as he carried the tray. He'd been warned by the older staff. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make mistakes. He made a mistake. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of people enjoying a meal. The dangerous silence of people holding their breath. Frank Sinatra's voice cut through the quiet. Sharp. Cold. The kind of voice that could end careers with a phone call. Everyone at the table looked down. The other diners pretended not to hear. The restaurant staff froze in place. And then from across the table, someone did the one thing no one ever dared to do. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand who Frank Sinatra was in 19... He wasn't just a singer. He was power itself, distilled into a 5'7" frame, with blue eyes and a voice that could make presidents pause. Frank had won an Oscar. He owned his own record label. He performed at John F. Kennedy's inauguration. He could fill any venue in America. His albums sold millions. His movies made money. His approval could launch a career. His disapproval could end one. People in Hollywood spoke about Frank in hushed tones, the way you speak about forces of nature. You didn't cross him. You didn't embarrass him. You didn't make him look small. Those who did paid for it. There are stories, documented, verified stories, of Frank making phone calls that got people fired from studios, of columnists who criticized him finding their sources dried up overnight, of musicians who disrespected him, never working in certain venues again. This wasn't mob violence. This was something more sophisticated. This was the careful application of influence, a word to the right person, a favor called in, a door closed so quietly you didn't hear it until you tried to open it. Frank's anger was legendary, not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly, the cold kind, the calculated kind, the kind that remembered, and everyone knew it. The members of the Rat Pack, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, they were Frank's friends, his brothers, but even they understood the hierarchy. Frank was the chairman of the board. What Frank said went. When Frank was angry, you waited for it to pass. You didn't challenge him. You didn't correct him. You certainly didn't tell him he was wrong, because Frank Sinatra didn't get told he was wrong. This was the reality of being in Frank's orbit. The privilege came with a price. Access to power meant accepting how power worked. And power worked through fear. Not fear of physical violence. Fear of exile. Fear of becoming invisible. Fear of being cut off from the world that Frank controlled. So when Frank's mood darkened, everyone around him became very, very careful. The restaurant was called Villa Capri, a small Italian place on McHatton, just off Hollywood Boulevard. It wasn't the fanciest place in Los Angeles, but it was private, quiet, the kind of spot where famous people could eat without cameras. Frank loved it there. He knew the owner, had his regular table in the corner. The staff knew his order, his preferences, when to approach and when to stay away. On this particular night, according to those who were present, the energy at Frank's table was already tense. Something had happened earlier, a business deal gone wrong, a phone call that didn't go the way Frank wanted. The details are lost, but the mood was dark. The young waiter, we'll call him Michael, though his real name has been lost to time, was working his first week at Villa Capri. He'd been hired because he needed the money. He had no connection to the entertainment world, didn't know the unwritten rules, didn't understand that serving Frank Sinatra's table required a specific kind of invisible competence. Michael approached with a tray of drinks, placed them carefully on the table, one by one, and then he made his mistake. He placed Frank's drink, Jack Daniels, neat in front of Dean Martin by accident, then realized his error, reached across to correct it. His hand, nervous and shaking, brushed against Frank's shoulder. The table went silent. Frank looked up slowly. His blue eyes locked on Michael, the kind of look that x-rayed you, that found every weak spot and cataloged it. "You just touched me," Frank said. His voice was quiet, too quiet. Michael's face went white. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinatra. I didn't ask for an explanation. I asked if you just touched me." "Yes, sir. I'm very sorry. It was an accident." "An accident?" Frank repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. "You know what else is an accident? You working here tomorrow. That's an accident waiting to happen." Michael stood frozen. His hands were still holding the tray. His eyes were wide. Frank wasn't yelling. That's what made it worse. His voice was conversational, almost friendly, but everyone in the room could hear the edge underneath. "You know what your problem is?" Frank continued. "You don't know your place. You walk up to this table like you belong here, like you're somebody, but you're not somebody. You're the help, and the help doesn't touch me." Michael's face flushed red. He opened his mouth, closed it. The tray in his hands was trembling now, the glasses rattling slightly. "I should call your boss over here," Frank said. "Have him explain to me why he hired someone who doesn't know how to do his job. Maybe I should explain to him that this restaurant needs better standards." The threat was clear. Frank wasn't just talking about firing Michael. He was talking about making sure Michael's mistake became the owner's problem, that the owner would have to choose the new waiter or Frank Sinatra's continued patronage. It wasn't a choice at all. Michael stood there, humiliated, unable to move, unable to defend himself, unable to do anything except absorb the attack. And everyone in the room watched in silence. Silence has a weight. In that moment, in that restaurant, the silence was suffocating. Dean Martin looked down at his drink. Peter Lawford studied the tablecloth. Joey Bishop found something fascinating about the wall. The other diners, recognizable faces, people with their own power in Hollywood, suddenly became very interested in their food. No one said anything. No one looked at Michael. No one looked at Frank. This is how power works, not through violence, through the silent agreement of everyone present that challenging power is more dangerous than allowing cruelty to continue. Every person in that room knew what Frank was doing was wrong, knew that Michael didn't deserve to be humiliated for an honest mistake, knew that the response was disproportionate to the offense. But knowing something is wrong and acting on that knowledge are two very different things, because if you speak up, you become the target. The humiliation transfers to you, the anger redirects, and Frank Sinatra's anger, as everyone knew, was something you avoided at all costs. This is the bystander effect. Psychologists have studied it. When everyone is watching, no one acts, because everyone assumes someone else will act. And when no one does, the silence becomes its own kind of approval. The silence says, this is acceptable. This is how powerful people are allowed to treat those beneath them. This is the price of access to this world. Michael stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably 30 seconds. His face was red. His eyes were wet. He was trying very hard not to cry in front of the room. Finally, he mumbled another apology and started to back away from the table. Frank wasn't done. "And another thing," he started. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Frank." One word. Quiet. Firm. Everyone's head turned. Sammy Davis Jr. was looking directly at Frank. Not with anger, not with judgment, just with steady, unmovable attention. Of all the people at that table, Sammy had the most to lose by speaking. He was black in an industry and an era that tolerated him only because his talent was undeniable. He was missing an eye from a car accident. He'd faced more discrimination, more cruelty, more casual dehumanization than anyone else in that room. And he was alive in Hollywood because Frank Sinatra had protected him, had made it clear that Sammy was part of the Rat Pack, had stood by him when hotels refused him rooms, when clubs wanted him to perform but not eat in their restaurants, when powerful people suggested Sammy didn't belong. Frank had protected Sammy, which meant Sammy owed Frank everything, which is why when Sammy spoke, everyone understood what it cost him. "Frank," Sammy said again. "He made a mistake. Let it go." The room froze. Frank's eyes moved to Sammy. For a moment, no one breathed. "What did you say?" Frank's voice was very quiet now. Sammy didn't break eye contact. "I said let it go." The kid's scared. He apologized. "It's done. Are you telling me how to handle my business? I'm telling you this isn't business. It's a kid who spilled a drink." The silence was different now. Not the silence of fear. The silence of everyone waiting to see if the world was about to end. Frank stared at Sammy. Sammy stared back. Then Frank looked at Michael, who was still frozen near the table. "Go," Frank said to him, not gently, but without the edge. "Get out of here." Michael didn't need to be told twice. He turned and walked quickly toward the kitchen, the tray still in his shaking hands. Frank turned back to Sammy. For a long moment, no one knew what would happen next. Then Frank picked up his drink, took a sip, set it down. "You got a lot of nerve, Sam." Sammy's expression didn't change. "I learned it from you." Something shifted in Frank's face. Not quite a smile, not quite forgiveness, but an acknowledgement. He didn't apologize. Frank Sinatra didn't apologize. But he didn't explode either. Didn't throw Sammy out. Didn't cut him off. He just moved on. Started talking about something else. Let the tension dissipate. And everyone at the table understood what had just happened. Sammy Davis Jr. had done something almost impossible. He'd told Frank Sinatra no, and survived. What happened in that restaurant wasn't about a spilled drink. It was about power. About the unspoken rules that govern spaces where some people matter and others don't. It was about silence. About how cruelty continues not because people support it, but because people are too afraid to stop it. And it was about courage. Courage doesn't always look like we expect it to. It's not always loud, not always dramatic. Sometimes courage is quiet. A single word, spoken calmly, in a moment when silence is safer. Sammy Davis Jr. had more reasons than anyone in that room to stay quiet. He had more to lose. His career, his friendship, his safety, all of it depended on Frank's goodwill. But he spoke anyway. Not because he thought he'd win, not because he knew Frank would back down, but because watching someone be humiliated while you sit silent changes you, makes you complicit, makes you part of the machinery of cruelty. Sammy chose, in that moment, to be something else. The story of that night spread quietly through Hollywood, not in newspapers, not in official accounts, but in whispered conversations, in late-night discussions about what it meant, about what it cost. Some said Frank respected Sammy more after that standing up to him was the only thing Frank truly understood. Others said Sammy took a risk that could have destroyed everything he'd built. Both things are probably true. What we know for certain is that Michael, the waiter, kept his job. He worked at Villa Capri for another year before moving on. He never spoke publicly about that night, but those who knew him said he never forgot it, never forgot the feeling of being small, and never forgot that someone spoke up when they didn't have to. This story asks us to think about our own moments of silence, the times we watched someone being treated cruelly and said nothing, the times we told ourselves it wasn't our business, or the risk was too high, or someone else would speak up, the times we chose safety over integrity. Those moments define us more than we'd like to admit. Sammy Davis Jr. showed us what the alternative looks like. Not perfect, not risk-free, but real. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say one word, no, especially when everyone else is silent. This story is a cinematic dramatization inspired by real personalities and documented power dynamics of the era. Its purpose is not to accuse, but to explore what courage looks like when silence is safer.